certainly from a selfish standpoint, you have to recognize worst case scenarios. You have to plan. Moving toward a more resilient supply chain. Well, here to speak with us about that today is John Mascaritolo, Professor of Supply Chain Management at Clayton State University. John, welcome.
Thank you, Russell.
John, I guess threshold question is, why should a supply chain professional be concerned about making the supply chain at his or her company more resilient? Walk us through that. Why?
Well, today, companies no longer compete that much on brand name as much as they compete on the strength of their supply chain. Companies today, especially the supply chain discipline, should pay attention to what that need is, because the stronger the supply chain, the more competitive their company becomes. Today, the corporation is now expanding its responsibilities to cover now the supplier's supplier and the customer's customer. And with those two additional scopes of responsibility brings in more opportunities for disruption or for just general failure, more risk and burden. Also, from that point of view, you have globalization has kicked in, which is much more broader. It brings much more strain on the supply chain, as well as strain on the management to manage that. So you have quite a few things focusing all on that supply chain success, and it's a constant flow for delivery solution.
You make quite a compelling argument that certainly from a selfish standpoint, a professional needs to be moving toward resilience because the company's very lifeblood depends upon it.
Correct.
Well, now that we've established how important it is to have this resilient supply chain, what are the steps to bring that about? What has to be done to have this type of supply chain?
Well, you have to recognize the worst case scenario is going to happen. You have to plan for that. You have to recognize disruptions, whether that be weather or Asian flu or strikes, geopolitics, political issues kick in. What country are you really sourcing from? How much trouble is it to get in and get out? What happens if war breaks out again like we had in the past? You have terrorist issues where supply chain is a straight focus on disruption, ports of call, ports of entry. All those things are falling into our lap for our sensitivity to make sure none of that happens. So it's rather important for every time you open up the newspaper, and if you're globally responsible, you have to pay attention to what's going on globally. You have to make sure your people are safe if there's a problem, if there's a political situation or war like we lived through Afghanistan, when as long as the ports were open, you still have to get that product into the country. So your partnerships are very, very important. Your carriers, all those people have to be on the same page as you are to make sure your company still is competitive, has that competitive advantage on a solid supply chain.
You know, it's interesting. We have recognized for a number of years now that on the organizational chart, you've got all these C-suite offices, right? You've got the CEO and the chief operating officer and the chief technology officer and on and on and on. And of course, the chief supply chain officer position has been created at a number of companies. So my question to you is, you've been talking about how important resilience is. Mm-hmm. Is a officer of resilience, is a resilient officer, if you will, is that something that is so crucial to a company that there needs to be a special department or officer position created?
I believe it should be. Now, whether it's that title, that's up to the company, but that person's sole responsibility should be looking for cracks in the supply chain, looking for disruption, potential disruptions, analyzing that disruptions and doing what ifs. Get everybody involved in your global source and your global supply to start playing out those scenarios when they're not under pressure. And this should be an ongoing exercise. It's just like quality. Once you start a quality program, you can't stop it. Just because your supply chain is running well now, you just can't say it's good, because tomorrow another disruption or another change is gonna affect that. Or you may source, your company may source to a different country, and now that's a whole nother infrastructure that wasn't involved or anticipate. Supply chain and logistics always has to be ahead of the curve. It always has to be out there, ready to go, ready to have product come to it, and that's what makes it nice and smooth. You have to anticipate, you have to know where you're going, and you have to plan for that. And I think that person will be very critical to the corporation.
You're telling us that it's crucial to have somebody who takes a prospective view, to see what is coming up ahead, as opposed to, so often the retrospective view that companies take in when they're looking at how well they may have done in past or whatever.
You have to be proactive.
Someone who's proactive and forward-looking. Consistency, efficiency, effectiveness, these are important things clearly in any supply chain. How does one go about creating those, bringing those, ensuring that those things take place?
Well, one of the things, and they all intertwine with one another, you have to be able to see around the corner. You have to understand what is needed of your partners, what is needed of your core carrier network, what is needed of your people. Processes and procedures need to be documented so everybody has a copy of them. There's certain disruptions you can't stop. Mother Nature, for example. But what you do is you plan what happens after the event occurs. What happens when the tsunami subsides and you see what's going on. That's when the plan takes over, because you recognize that. And everybody knows what their roles are. And that makes everybody on that same page again, working for the same solution. And if there is a disruption, we're not country-centric model anymore, which means if it happens in a country, it happens worldwide. Going back to that customer's customer scenario, when Japan had its tsunami, the companies in Japan were really a primary supplier to China's companies, who were the primary supplier to global companies. That's when the second supplier, or the tier one supplier to the tier one supplier, becomes the weakest link. Because once that tsunami hit, Japan couldn't supply China, China couldn't supply its contracts. So it's much more deeper now. So you have to understand this. You have to make sure everybody is doing the same thing you want them to do, and that's where the efficiency comes in. Forward thinking, anticipating, mitigating the situations, contingency planning, which has been on for years. But you just have to understand it, and so does everybody else. Everybody's a contributive part, especially your suppliers, your air freight forwarder, your global carriers. Those people are the ones that carry the biggest burden, because once they got it, they have to make sure their supply chain is solid as well. So everybody plays into, not just one person.
You know, when we think about the Tazreen fire in Bangladesh that took place a year ago, the floods in Thailand, we think about the tsunami in Japan, a couple of years back, the volcano in Iceland, and all the disruption that caused. That has meant that we've been talking about risk management, managing these risks quite a bit. Now let me be provocative here. We talk a good risk management game, but we don't really play it that well. How many companies, in your experience, are really prepared to manage this kind of business interruption that is created by these events?
Right. Very few, in my opinion. Because if the supply chain person who comes up with that, he'll never anticipate the volcano. But if there's some similar type of disaster, what expense is that going to incur for us to be ready for that? So senior management says, what's the chances of this happening? How many times has this volcano erupted? It only takes once, and then everybody sees the ramification from it. So now that becomes a contingency planning. It becomes a mitigation. Next time it happens, what do we do? So if it's happened before historically and it can happen again, then maybe you get some open ears to your solution. But if you identify a potential risk and a maybe risk, then it's hard to justify money. So it's how much will the company suffer if it happens, and what's the chances of it happening? What's the risk? Is it so remote that it's not worth the effort, or is it immediate, like terrorism? We know, we just don't know when, but we know it's happened before. We know when it happens, it's a disruption. That should always be a risk attention getter. A tsunami, it just happens. Earthquakes, they happen. Weather is always there. It's a routine. But the volcano, that was a very interesting how the airlines just couldn't fly, and everybody was scurrying on the ground to make that delivery, but that's all you were able to do. But they reacted rather quickly, but it really was no cost, it was just a disruption. Now it gets to what is the cost of lost business, and then that's when the discussion has to happen. So if it's a open-minded senior management who recognizes this, and they recognize their product is so fragile, meaning supply is very limited and it has to still get to market, then they should be listening. But if it's just a general commodity, you probably are not going to get that.
Final question then. Final thoughts on how to effectively manage a resilient supply chain.
Communicate with everybody. Make them show or know what you're thinking. Make them know your strategy. You know their strategy. And I'm talking about your suppliers, your carriers, your third-party logistics partners, and definitely your employees. Everybody should know their role when something happens. There should be no wait for a phone call to start it. So it's forward thinking, seeing around the corner, anticipate, plan for the worst case scenario, and just have fun. You know?
Be on the same page and be flexible, I'm hearing.
Be extremely flexible.
John, I know you're busy here at the conference, but you found time to speak with us. I want to thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Great, thanks a lot. Enjoyed it.
That's John Mascaritolo, Clayton State University, speaking with us today about moving toward a resilient supply chain. Well, thank you for watching.